Please, just help me get through tonight, she whispered, and I had no idea what I was actually agreeing to. My name is Marcus Reyes, I'm 30, and I'd been living on a narrow street in Columbus, Ohio for almost 6 months, mostly keeping to myself after relocating for a job managing inventory at a mid-sized auto parts distributor. I didn't know my neighbors well, exchanging waves at best, until one Friday evening when a woman named Sophie Ellison knocked on my door looking flustered, asking if I could help carry a few things from her garage before her parents arrived for dinner. I said yes, mostly out of boredom, and spent the next 30 minutes hauling boxes and folding chairs while she apologized repeatedly for the short notice. What she didn't mention, not yet anyway, was that 2 weeks earlier, during a phone call meant to reassure her mother she was doing fine on her own, Sophie had let slip that she was seeing someone, purely to end a conversation that had been circling her love life for the third time that month. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even really a decision. It was the kind of lie that escapes before you can stop it, the kind you assume will quietly dissolve on its own, until her mother announced a surprise visit and asked with obvious excitement whether she'd finally get to meet him. She told me all of this later, but it's worth understanding exactly how it happened, because Sophie herself said she'd replayed that phone call 100 times trying to figure out the moment things spiraled. Her mother had called on a Tuesday night asking, as she did almost every week, whether Sophie had met anyone yet, gently reminding her that she wasn't getting any younger and that her cousin Rachel had just gotten engaged. Sophie, exhausted after a long shift and tired of the same conversation on repeat, said the first thing that came to mind just to change the subject, that yes, actually, she had been seeing someone for a little while. Her mother's reaction was so immediate and so joyful, an audible gasp, a flood of questions, that Sophie found herself unable to walk it back without disappointing her all over again. So she kept going, inventing small details on the spot, that he was kind, that he had a stable job, that she was taking things slow. She assumed the conversation would fade into background noise the way most phone calls with her mother eventually did. Instead, 2 weeks later, her mother announced she and Roger were driving down for the weekend specifically to finally meet him, and Sophie spent the following 6 days in a low-grade panic that culminated in her knocking on my door asking for help with boxes, less because she urgently needed to move furniture, and more because she was quietly hoping some solution would present itself before dinner. By the time I finished helping with the boxes, Sophie invited me to stay for dinner, an offer that seemed harmless enough, and I accepted without a second thought, imagining a quiet meal with strangers before heading home to my own empty apartment. Her parents, Linda and Roger, arrived exactly on time, carrying a bottle of wine and a tray of homemade lasagna, greeting me with the kind of open, curious warmth that made it clear they already had expectations about who I might be. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Easy questions about my job, the neighborhood, how long I'd lived there, until Sophie set down her glass, looked at her parents, and announced, with far more confidence than the situation warranted, that I was her boyfriend. I froze mid-bite, staring at her, waiting for the joke to land, but her expression told me this wasn't a joke at all. Linda's face lit up instantly, both hands pressed to her chest, while Roger nodded slowly like a long-standing worry had finally been resolved. Before I could say anything to correct the record, the questions began, rapid and eager. How long have you two been together? Why hadn't Sophie mentioned him sooner? Was this serious? Sophie fielded most of it herself, her answers smoother than someone genuinely caught off guard should have managed, which told me this hadn't been an accident so much as a desperate improvisation. Under the table, her foot pressed against mine, and the moment her parents got distracted debating whether the lasagna needed more basil, she leaned close and delivered the whisper that would define the rest of my evening. Please, just help me get through tonight, she said. I'll explain everything after, I promise. I sat there running the math in my head. I could stand up right then and tell her parents the truth, that I was a neighbor who'd been helping move boxes 2 hours earlier and had no idea what boyfriend she was referring to, and watch her face collapse in front of the two people she most wanted to impress. Or I could play along for one dinner, one single night, and sort out the fallout once her parents were gone. Looking at the barely concealed panic behind her eyes, the choice wasn't difficult. I picked up my fork, smiled, and said we'd met a few months back through a friend, deliberately vague enough that Sophie could build on it however she needed. For the rest of the meal, I became, against every ounce of logic, Sophie's boyfriend for exactly one night. I complimented Linda's cooking generously, listened to Roger describe a fishing trip in far more detail than necessary, and even laughed convincingly at a story about how nervous I'd apparently been the first time I met them, an event that had, as far as I knew, never happened. Just as I thought we were in the clear, Linda's sister Aunt Pam arrived unannounced, having heard from Linda earlier that day that Sophie's mystery boyfriend was finally making an appearance, and she wasn't about to miss it. Aunt Pam settled into the empty chair beside me with the energy of someone who watched crime documentaries for a hobby, immediately peppering me with questions designed to catch inconsistencies. What was Sophie's coffee order? What side of the bed did I sleep on when I stayed over? Had I met her college roommate yet? Sophie's hand found mine under the table, gripping it hard enough that I understood the message clearly. Keep going. I answered as vaguely and confidently as I could manage, deflecting the trickier questions with humor, claiming I always let Sophie pick the coffee shop since she had strong opinions about oat milk, which earned an approving laugh from Linda and a slightly suspicious narrowing of Aunt Pam's eyes that told me she wasn't entirely convinced but had decided for the moment to let it go. She wasn't finished, though. A few minutes later, refilling her wine glass, she asked almost casually what my middle name was, the kind of question a real boyfriend of several months would answer without hesitation. I said Daniel, which happened to be true, purely by luck, and Aunt Pam nodded slowly, filing it away like a detective checking a box on a mental list. Then she asked how Sophie and I had celebrated her birthday back in March, a date I obviously knew nothing about, and for a half-second the table went quiet as I scrambled for an answer. Sophie jumped in before I could dig myself deeper, claiming we'd kept it low-key that year, just dinner at home, because I'd been swamped at work, which was vague enough to survive scrutiny, but specific enough to sound rehearsed. Aunt Pam raised an eyebrow, glanced at Linda, then let the subject drop, though I caught her studying me for the rest of the meal with the expression of someone who hadn't fully closed the case. Once Linda brought out her peach cobbler, warm and dripping with vanilla ice cream she insisted was non-negotiable, Roger reached over and shook my hand firmly, telling me how relieved he was that Sophie had finally settled down after years of him worrying she'd end up alone in that house. I had no idea what years of worry meant exactly, but I nodded solemnly, playing the part of a man who'd clearly heard this speech before. When her parents and Aunt Pam finally said their goodbyes near the door, hugging me like I'd been part of the family for a decade rather than a dinner, I stood there feeling both relieved and completely drained. The second the car pulled out of the driveway, Sophie shut the door, leaned her forehead against it, and let out a long breath. "You must think I'm insane," she finally said, turning to face me, eyes still wide with leftover adrenaline. "I told my mom I was seeing someone weeks ago just to get her to stop worrying, and I never thought she'd actually show up expecting to meet you." I asked why she hadn't just corrected the lie the second her mother mentioned visiting, and Sophie admitted quietly that some part of her had wanted it to be true, had wanted, for one evening, to feel like the version of her life her parents had been hoping for. We ended up sitting on her kitchen counter for the next 2 hours, dissecting the entire evening, laughing about Aunt Pam's interrogation, comparing notes on which lies had nearly gotten us caught, until it stopped feeling like damage control and started feeling like the easiest conversation I'd had with anyone in months. Before I left that night, I told her, half joking, that if she ever needed a fake boyfriend again, my rate had gone up considerably after surviving Aunt Pam's questioning. She laughed and said she'd keep that in mind, then added, more seriously, that she hoped next time it wouldn't have to be fake at all. 2 weeks later, just when I thought the whole ordeal had quietly closed itself out, Sophie showed up at my door holding her phone like it was radioactive. Her mother had called that morning, already planning Thanksgiving, and had, without asking, informed the entire extended family that Sophie's boyfriend would be joining them at Linda's sister's house in November, an event that traditionally involved close to 20 relatives, most of whom now apparently knew my name from Aunt Pam's retelling of the interrogation. Sophie looked at me with the same panicked expression from that first dinner and asked if this was the part where I ran. I told her, half joking, that I'd already survived Aunt Pam once, and Thanksgiving couldn't possibly be worse, though some part of me suspected I was about to be proven wrong. We spent that evening on her couch mapping out a more consistent backstory, actual dates that lined up, a real coffee order I could recite under pressure, my supposed birthday gift to her, treating the whole thing less like a lie we were maintaining and more like a story we were slowly, carefully building into something that could survive an entire family's scrutiny. Somewhere around midnight, comparing notes with a level of detail that bordered on absurd, Sophie looked up from her notebook and said this might be the strangest way two people had ever gotten to know each other, and I told her I couldn't disagree, though I also couldn't remember the last time getting to know someone had felt this easy. Over the following weeks, what started as a favor kept extending itself, coffee that turned into dinner, dinner that turned into long phone calls, until neither of us was pretending anything anymore. When Linda and Roger visited again 3 months later, Sophie didn't need to whisper any instructions under the table, didn't need to invent a backstory or nudge my foot to keep me talking. I was simply there, already known, already trusted, the guy who'd shown up on a random Friday to help move a few boxes and somehow ended up staying for good. Aunt Pam, to her credit, still occasionally brought up the coffee order incident, insisting she'd known something was off that first night, though she admitted she'd never expected the ending to actually work out this well for either of us.